Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. Good Faith is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And my guest today is someone who has been helping people, many people, make sense of the world professionally. He's Jon Ward. He's the senior political correspondent for Yahoo News. And for decades, Jon, as a journalist, has been helping people make sense of the White House, Congress, and other political institutions. And he's done this in his writing and also in his excellent podcast, The Long Game. So, Jon, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you, Curtis. Appreciate you having me on. Looking forward to talking.
Yeah. And in fact, I have appeared on Jon's podcast a year and a half ago when he covered my work on Christians and the vaccine. And during that time, I had a couple of experiences in doing that podcast, Jon. The first was envy, because I really like the name of my podcast, Good Faith. But if there was one podcast that I would like, I wish I'd gotten to that name first, it's The Long Game. I love that name. Tell me more why you titled, and you beat me to the punch, your podcast, The Long Game.
You know, there are other podcasts called The Long Game. So if you ever want to just try to completely obliterate me, just go for it. There are two reasons why I call it that. One is that it's always been my approach to things, I think, just in general. Two is I started it in 2017, and I was trying to understand the long-term and structural causes of our political polarization and dysfunction and gridlock.
Yeah.
And I was also trying to understand how the Republican Party nominated a candidate that was the choice of only a third of its members. So all of that was sort of structural, long-term stuff. And I was also gravitating towards a more solutions-based form of journalism. And I just knew that whatever the causes were, they didn't get there overnight, and they weren't going to be fixed overnight. And so, the tortoise and the hare has always been one of my favorite, of Aesop's fables. If I'm hopefully not getting that wrong, I think
that's right. I think that's right. Yeah.
Temperamentally, I am a crock pot, not a microwave.
I like that. All right. And so one was envy. The other feeling that I had when we were doing the interview was curiosity, because as we were talking, you were being professional, Jon Ward, professional journalist. So you were interested in me telling my story, and you weren't tipping your own personal hand. But some of the questions you were asking, I thought, this guy feels like an insider. Like the questions he's asking feels like he's an insider to the evangelical culture. And I left our interview wondering, what's his story? And now I know your story, because you've just written a book called Testimony: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. And boy, what a story it is. I think it is an important and relevant story. And we will get into the substance of this book shortly. But first, I want to help readers grasp what kind of a book Testimony is. And I think the title in some ways already tells you. And the way I've been describing it to people when they ask me, like, what are you reading? And I was like, well, it's this really interesting book called Testimony. And they asked me, well, what is it about? And I said, well, the best way to describe this is, I think it's a memoir of an evangelical in deconstruction. Evangelical deconstruction. And that term has come to sloppily mean almost anything and everything, including people who are just chucking Jesus entirely. And that's not what is happening in this book. I think this book I call it a memoir of evangelical deconstruction, because I think it captures the more precise, accurate definition of deconstruction, which is that it is part of a process that you have to go through if you're going to get to reconstruction, if you're going to actually, and your book actually follows something of the structure of the first, 3 quarters to me seems like it's deconstruction. And the last chapters, to me, I read it as, this is somebody who is trying to put some pieces together, back together, put new pieces, repair old pieces, so that you can follow Jesus in a more robust, healthy way. Is that a fair reading, Jon? Is that what you intended to convey?
Sure. I mean, you're getting at one of the dilemmas of rhetoric, which is when a term becomes cliched or overused or even bastardized, you know, do you shy away or do you try to reclaim it? I have tended not to use the term deconstruction because of the very reasons you refer to. It's, one of the things that I don't like or that I try to steer clear of is when a term becomes something that people have taken and put it in a box and they use it either as a battering ram
Yeah.
or as a filter to kind of automatically categorize and interpret. Those are all methods for reducing understanding, and words to me are tools for understanding. So if I see a word begin to be used in that way, and you see it all the time in politics, I tend to try to start trying to look for other terms and other forms of language to describe it. But I think your description is absolutely right. I've heard other people call it a spiritual memoir. I like that. I had a young writer named Isaac Willauer. I don't even actually know if I'm saying his name right, but he writes on Substack, and he's a student at Grove City College. And we've gotten to know each other through AEI. He called it, I think, a memoir of construction. But I think he was kind of getting at the same thing that you are. And what came to mind as you were talking, Curtis, actually, is that I think you can even set faith aside, I think, but certainly a healthy faith walk or journey is going to have elements of deconstruction
Yeah.
and reconstruction ongoing all the time. It's just part of life. It's part
Yeah.
of growing and evolving.
Yeah.
And if I'm not looking at the words on the page in the book that I just wrote and thinking, as I talk about it and think about, critiques or feedback, if I'm not doing some deconstruction of that, then I'm not probably moving forward in the way I need to.
I think that's right. And it seems to me that that's true, as you said, in almost any truth you are exploring. But I want to make the case that, especially for Christian faith in Jesus and his good news, that it's absolutely critical. It's baked into the very structure of the gospel. And the reason is because God, for some really mysterious but also really beautiful reasons, has chosen to reveal himself through human beings, through fallen human beings. This is the story of the Bible from the Old Testament, God revealing himself through Israel, and then Jesus entrusting his good news to these 12 apostles, who the gospels are very clear are very fallen, very fragile, very in some ways broken people in their own ways, and it has been God's choice to reveal himself through human beings from one generation to another, which means that the vehicle of transmission is always going to have some element of fallenness to it, because it's through God has chosen to work through humans. And I love the way that Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 4, when he talks about that we have this treasure in jars of clay. Right? So the treasure is Jesus in the gospel. The vessel, the container, is this jars of clay, which he makes clear is broken and fragile and weak. He's talking about physical fragility, but you can apply this to moral, cultural, any other forms of fragility and brokenness. And it's clear, like, okay, we're going to receive the gospel, especially from one generation to another, in these jars of clay that are going to have its flaws to it. And so, if that's the case, every generation has to do the work of deconstruction. And by that, we mean looking at this jar of clay and saying, wow, that base was a lot wobblier than it should be. That handle is cracked. There's this big, whatever structural weakness in this design or something like that. And every generation has to do the work of, okay, how do we honor and hold the treasure that is there, that is timeless and true, but nevertheless doesn't come to us like straight in unfiltered form or uncontained form. It always comes in a human container. And therefore, every generation has to do the work of saying, hey, what do I think about this piece? What do I think about that piece? How do I put this back together?
Mm-hmm.
Does that resonate with you, John, in terms of, because I feel like your book is like, it's almost a memoir of somebody going through that process.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate a lot of the ways that you think and write and talk about this stuff, Curtis. It is generative, in my view. To use a term that I probably first heard from Mako Fujimura. Um, as I listen to you talk, it's a way of thinking and embody about faith and embodying faith that is expansive and is moving outward,
Yeah.
and is not. I just was getting a picture actually as you were speaking of this sense of expansion,
Yeah.
of growth, just the way you were helping me to think about faith in this way, um, and I think unfortunately too many times growing up I was um, being trained in a way of viewing faith as um, static
Yeah.
and a sense of these are the answers
Yeah.
and we're going to teach them to you and they do not change. The metaphor that I've been thinking about lately is one of a house where I've made the critique that the structure of the house being evangelical culture, evangelicalism, is compromised. And I make sure to point out I'm not writing this book to bash evangelicals. I think there are so many good people in evangelical churches. What I'm critiquing is evangelicalism,
Mhm.
and I think what's really interesting about the metaphor of the house to me is that I think I'm saying I've been excavating around the foundation.
Yeah.
I've been looking at how it got there, what materials went into building it, who were the people that built it, when did that happen, um, how solid is this foundation and the structure, and what are the ways that I think are good about this building, and what are the things that I think are unhealthy about this building. And I think what's interesting about evangelicalism is that a lot of times people inside the house tend to sort of automatically react to critique and label it as divisive or
Mm.
ungrateful or too negative. And my only response to that is that's you may not agree with some of my statements or my conclusions, but have you even been outside the house to look at
Yeah.
the foundation, to study how this building came to be? I keep coming back to Jamie Smith's thought that evangelicals tend to think of their beliefs as hatched rather than formed,
Mm.
as
Mm.
if as
Yeah.
if those answers I was taught in Sunday school were handed down on stone tablets rather
Right.
than being the product of generational, cultural, historical deposits
Yeah.
over time that build up. And I do love your focus on the generational task, very much.
Well, let's dive into the book then, because one of the things I really like about the book is there are sort of sweeping scholarly analyses that try to outline the house and how it got to be. I think of, Kristen Kobes-Dumez's book, Jesus and John Wayne, that explores sort of the gender foundations of the book. And that's like a scholarly analysis, and that's fine. But there's something I think about the memoir as a genre that is also very well suited to it, because these things are so particular, they're so specific to the house is so sprawling, right? Like it's hard to make generalizations that apply to every aspect of the evangelical house, that it almost is helpful to also have a tour guide go through the house. This is my corner of the house, and this is what it was like for me to live in this house. And that's how I sort of read testimony. And so I want to ask you if you can give a brief summary of your story so people can just sort of get the narrative arc. And I wanted to ask you, like, if your story was a 5-act play, or you could choose the number, it could be 4-act or 3 acts, whatever you want. But what are the acts, and what's the synopsis of each act?
I was thinking recently about uh, these books that are making this critique of evangelicalism, that it is a cultural construct that often thinks of itself as a theological construct. Kristen's book is one. I think Duke Kwan's book,
Mm-hmm.
Greg Thompson's book on reparations,
Yeah.
is another. Greg was the one who I think I first heard make that comment about theological versus cultural. There are many others, but I think this is a critique that um, I don't know if it's growing or not. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. But you told me about this 5-act question, and I broke it down into 5 acts. So I'll just get into that.
Awesome.
But before I do that, just really briefly, I mean, I grew up the son of a evangelical minister. My parents both became born again Christians in the 70s as part of the Jesus movement, and I was the first, infant dedicated in the church that they started with their friends. My dad led protests outside abortion clinics. He was a C.S. Lewis scholar who was working on his master's thesis about C.S. Lewis. I'm the oldest of 7 kids. I grew up going to church. And so this brings me sort of into my 5-act construct. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say until college, that would be act 1, just youth, childhood and youth indoctrination, and generally ambivalence marked by occasional moments of, religious experience in maybe like a youth group meeting or a retreat or something like that. That was really the only world that I knew, was the world of church. I was homeschooled for 6th, 7th, or 7th, 8th, and 9th. And I went to the church school where only members, children could attend for all of elementary school. So I didn't know much else. I played a lot of sports. That was really what I cared about. Act 2 would be my college, second 2 years of college, and then a couple years after that, which I would probably just summarize as religious zealotry, maybe even fanaticism. I really, I was recruited essentially by the church to become more involved in the college ministry, and I dove in head first, devoted all my time that I wasn't, in class at the University of Maryland, to being a small group leader, going to discipleship groups with other young men, and just doing a lot of church stuff. I think one of the things that disillusioned me with church was the sense that we were spending all this time inside the church, talking about the faith, not doing a lot to demonstrate the love of Christ to those who need it. Our understanding of sharing the gospel was largely just telling people to come to our church and to share our beliefs. And I really did hunger for a faith that was more about expressing through tangible acts of service
Mm.
and love
Mm.
the same love of Christ. And so that was one of the things that I think caused me to move on, along with the very intense Calvinist theology, which was really misshaped, and a lot of our understandings of many things, including sex and sexuality, and produced a lot of self-loathing and even depression.
Yeah.
Act 3 would be the separation from that, and the recovery period into my mid to late 20s. I got married at age 28. I started in journalism at age 24, I believe. Spent years just sort of toiling, to catch up, to learn about the world, and just gain basic knowledge about how to be a functioning member of society outside of that church bubble. First child is at 30. And then act 4 would be ambition, just building my career, building my family, seeking to make my way in the world, which I probably went from, I don't know, to, my early 30s to some, how old was I? So like my late 30s. So most of my
Yeah.
30s would have been about ambition. Act 5 would be the last, 7, 8, 9 years, which I would characterize as a period of building, trying to think about, what comes after me, my children, in building institutions. Yuval Levin has been a big influence, and just trying to do less out of ambition and more out of service. I would
Yeah.
say.
Well, that's a great narrative structure. I want to ask you, though, about then following up on that, about the emotional texture that's woven throughout this story. When I was reading it, so I read some reviews of the book, and there was one review that said, he's being very critical, very judgmental of the evangelical church. And it was funny because I read it, now that was not the dominant emotion
Mm,
that I picked up when I was reading it. The dominant emotion I felt as I was reading your story was perhaps best characterized as anguish.
mm.
I felt a lot of anguish. And so I wanted to ask you, what was it like emotionally for you to write this book, to go back through this story, to walk through this corner of the house? What did it feel like?
It was a lot of it was cathartic,
Okay.
to work through things, connect dots, make sense of it, and see it more clearly. There were also certainly times where I was revisiting periods just over the last few years that were difficult, where it was heavy to write about, and it was painful to do so. Um, and
And I assume this had a lot to do with the sort of very gripping stories you have about your relationship with your family.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think just everything that came down to the last several years of
Yeah.
watching the Republican Party capitulate to Donald Trump, and I can still sort of feel that feeling of the summer of 2015, where we went from this can't be real to this is real,
Yeah.
uh, and that's just everything that follows after that is stuff that I think we're all still trying to um,
There's
grapple
so
with.
much emotional pain still out there around that whole
Yeah,
trajectory. Yeah,
yeah,
that I think you articulate really well in the story.
yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think is most striking about the Trump years, or maybe one of the most interesting summations, is Tucker Carlson's summation of Donald Trump in those text messages, where one of the responses from Trump defenders, Hugh Hewitt is somebody who did this interview with me recently, is that conservatives got the Supreme Court that they wanted, and I liked his policies, but no. And I just thought Carlson's critique of Trump was, maybe some people would think it was hyperbolic, but he just demolished the idea. That was his view, was that just there was nothing redeemable about the Trump years. I don't even know if I would go that far, because I think you could point to some uh, policy wins as a conservative that you would say, unequivocally those were good things. But I definitely do agree that he showed no respect or interest in sort of the democratic traditions of our country, and he proved that after the 2020 election. I also just feel like his assault on truth was so acidic to the character of evangelicalism, and
Yeah.
one of the things that's really grieved me the most is to see this culture that raised me to prize and value truth and understanding,
Yeah.
um, uh, support and become a part of a movement that is now, to some degree, certainly during the year 2020, was basically just went all in on relativism
Yeah.
about things that we actually do know, while
Yeah.
while exhibiting sort of dogmatic certainty about things that we actually need faith for.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about this book and what it might reveal, both in terms of like sociological reality, but also emotional reality to those who are outside the evangelical world, who have never been part of that house. Because I read it as somebody who grew up in that culture. I had this experience like, oh yeah, yeah. Like, when you wrote about kissing, dating, goodbye, which is sort of this book about that was pervasive in the evangelical subculture around dating. I was like, I remember that. I remember our youth group agonizing over this book. So there's a lot of things that if you're an evangelical, you read this book, it's almost like listening to, I don't know, MTV in the 80s or something like that. You're like, oh, all the hits that you remember. Um, but I'm curious, like, what do you want to convey to somebody who's never been part of that evangelical culture? What do you want them to realize, again, either factually and I think especially emotionally, what it was like to grow up in that subculture?
Man, well, there's a lot of thoughts going. There's like all these, colliding neurons in my brain right now. Not sure which direction to go. There's a reason why there's so many people in these churches, and why charismatic non-denominational Christianity is growing in certain parts of the world. In Brazil, I think it's on pace to outgrow Catholicism. Um, and that's because the evangelical style of worship service, and its focus on creating a feeling of intimacy with God, is a very powerful force, and it's not all bad in my view. I mean, I think, going back to evangelicalism's roots, I might get the term wrong, but one of the sort of fundamental strands of it is this sense of having a heart connection to God.
Yep, that's right.
And that's hundreds of years old.
Yep.
And I think that that's a huge resource for good, if channeled correctly. I think one of the main critiques of the book is that it hasn't been channeled correctly. But this world in which I was raised, these moments of spiritual intensity and euphoria are incredibly powerful and life dominating. And then when you layer on top of that a taught construct that this is the way that you please the creator of all reality, so there's a mandate to do it. Those are two powerful forces, an attractive force and a compelling force towards this very intense and isolating experience. Because it's isolating too, because there are a lot of people who don't live in that world, and to your point of the question, to the point of your question, they can't relate to it.
Yeah.
And so it does push you sort of away from other people at the same time.
That's a great set of insights. So one emotion that I picked up that we had a little bit of an email exchange about before we did this podcast was I picked up the emotion of anxiety. Now, this could very well be because in 2 weeks' time, I'm releasing a book on anxiety. So, like a hammer that sees the world as a nail, I'm sure there's something of that going on. But I think it's more than that, because I really, picked it up on all of these sort of different levels that you were experiencing evangelicalism. At the interior level, I was really struck by how much, especially I think in your act, was it act 2 or act 3? I can't remember. I think act 2 is characterized by this intense sense of like, am I okay? Am I pure enough? Am I radical enough? Am I committed enough? Like this intense spiritual anxiety that you're narrating. At the institutional level, the story of growing up in these churches, I found this really pervasive feeling that you often find in high commitment, what sociologists call high sodality movements that draw high boundaries between you and the world. Those walls are often constructed out of anxiety of like who's in, who's out, and always feeling like you could at any moment be put on the out group and needing to conform in order to stay in the in group, and that anxiety is a emotion that constructs the walls that keeps people sort of compliant in these walls. So I found spiritual anxiety, I found institutional anxiety, and then certainly when you get to talking about act 5, about the last 8 years, just the pervasive cultural, social, political anxiety among evangelicals that the world, the secular establishment is out to get us, and therefore we need our defender in Trump, and we're willing to hold our nose and make whatever compromises out of the sense of anxiety, really, that we're going to be overrun otherwise. So I felt that, and then we had this funny email exchange where you're like, "Huh, that's interesting. I just did a search and I like, you hadn't actually used very much the words anxiety, fear, or worry. And yet somehow I picked that up in the story. So let's explore that. Like, to what extent um, do you feel like the evangelical culture you grew up in did have that pervasive anxiety that I picked up? And then the really interesting question I want to explore with you is, if that's true, how come you didn't name it as such that? Because I have a hypothesis on that I want to explore with you. So
Oh, I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
yeah.
To bring Fujimura up again, he has a great quote where he says the post-resurrection reality or disposition is one of relaxed confidence.
Mm-hmm.
I think that term, relaxed confidence, is where I want to be as a person of faith, as a follower of Christ, and I think it follows logically from the Christian
Yeah.
gospel. Um, my most intense experiences of anxiety and understanding what I was experiencing as anxiety have definitely come since having children, and I've often thought that the increased vulnerability
Yeah.
of having these human beings in the world who are, you know, have come from me and my wife, and you love them more than life itself, and you ultimately cannot control the degree to which they are protected or hurt. I mean, that is that is, I think, just opens you up to so much more pain.
Yeah.
Obviously, the reality of children is inc- just
Yeah.
unspeakable joy and
Yeah.
happiness. But the other side of the coin is that you are now more exposed than ever. And I've I don't my experiences of anxiety have manifested over a range of things. There was a period where I had anxiety about air travel, where I had never experienced it before. During the Ebola outbreak, I was really anxious about that. I had never worried about any kind of pandemic before that. And then, during the Trump years, I experienced a lot of anxiety just about the future of the country. Um, I There was one way you talked about anxiety. Oh, the in-group feeling. I don't have any real memories of feeling a huge sense of worry about that. I have always held in-group membership at some remove, just
Mm.
emotionally,
Yeah.
and wanted to have a sense of independence from that, to be able to be more of a truth teller than a belonger.
Mm.
Um, but I do think there's a lot of fear baked into the ways that I was taught about religion and faith and like ultimate reality.
Mm-hmm.
The emphasis on, or just even the belief in a place where people are sent if they don't believe the right thing,
Yeah.
um, and are tortured forever. I mean, that's obviously very fear-inducing,
Yeah.
and I think in my limited experience of talking to a therapist, he helped me think about my inner child, and I began to wonder how much of a of a childhood I had, in the sense that I was always probably very aware of the need to conform or live up to
Yeah.
a set of standards and rules, and the sense of punishment that would come if I did not meet that criteria. And so that, I haven't explored that as much as I would like. But I, I do think there's something there. I just haven't fully explored it.
Yeah. Well, I do think that you're onto something there because as I write about in the book, so much of our adult experiences of anxiety are deeply formed in our childhood. That is where our emotional self gets its sort of neurological pathways laid down. And it is, for me, similarly, I opened my book with a story of my childhood, 8 years old, and a period of episode of anxiety there that just recurs as I am in my 20s, 30s, 40s, in different variations, but you can sort of see the same
Mm,
basic fear of loss and of abandonment that I
mm,
had. I was a latchkey kid
mm,
growing up, and so that sense of like I could get abandoned, I can no longer be provided for, just recurs itself over and over again, and leading up to a catastrophic episode of anxiety in my
mm.
40s. So I think you're onto something there, and I do think that the evangelical culture you described has was not one of relaxed confidence, was not it was not, or John Mark Homer's phrase, it was not a non-anxious presence of your leaders. And that it would be interesting to explore how much that has set you up, even unknowingly. And the reason why the unknowingly, I think, is especially, I say that, is because when anxiety is unknown, when it's subconscious, when it's not actually named as such, that's when it exerts its greatest power. As with anything, when something is, we are not aware of it, is when it's actually most powerful, especially at the emotional level. And this is why the peculiar nature of evangelical anxiety, I think, is so powerful, because my hypothesis, and it's just a hypothesis, of why your narrative did not include many words of anxiety or worry and fear is because those words are banished from the evangelical vocabulary. And
Mm,
so as you're remembering that story, you're not going to use those words because those words aren't sort of allowed, because part of the, again, I think a dysfunction and a distortion of the evangelical house is that it, in many parts of it, especially this is true in both evangelical and the Pentecostal parts of the evangelical movement, that anxiety is viewed as actually a sin, or at least as a character flaw, or as a sign of lack of faith. And so we are supposed to pray anxiety away. Anxiety is a sign that you don't trust God.
yeah.
And so if that's the case, then of course you're not going to name it, because you're essentially confessing sin if you are saying I'm anxious. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in that kind of culture that prizes conformity and check off the right box, who's going to be really upfront about that? And this is why, for myself, even as a senior pastor, what led to my own breakdown was I felt like I could not name, both to myself, but certainly in public, the anxiety that was building up in me, because I was carrying this
Mm.
narrative that anxiety is a flaw, a spiritual flaw, or even a sin. And so
Something
that's
to be,
my hypothesis. What do you think about that, John?
yeah, I think you're getting at there's a sense of shame
Yep,
that's attached to
absolutely.
it.
That's right.
I'm remembering a sermon I heard. This was years after I had kind of walked out of the church I grew up in. And I don't remember why I ended up listening to this sermon. It was, on his recorded sermon. And it was one of the pastors from the home church that I grew up in. And he spent 10, 20 minutes talking about how he was in line at the airport and found himself growing anxious about missing his flight. And he kept using the word fretting as if this was some sort of theological insight. I'm not really sure why. But he ended up just um, lambasting himself
Hmm.
for having this anxiety. And it was clearly, I mean, I don't have notes or anything from it, but the clear implication was that, and probably he said it explicitly, was that he was sinning
Yeah.
by being anxious. My reaction at the time was, this is what we are focused on?
Yeah.
Like, of all the things in the world to be trying to make better, we're focused on trying to get less anxious about missing flights. Like, it's just so much minutia. Surely there are more important things we can focus on to be an influence for good and healing in the world. I was just like, to me, it was just another confirmation of why I had walked out of
Yeah.
this very small insular world. Um, I'm intrigued to understand this further. I do think you're right. As soon as you said, it was before you even said that those words of that terminology is banished, I was already realizing where you were going and pretty much agreeing with you. I don't and I don't know if that's why I didn't use it in the book, but it's as good of a theory as any. And it's interesting that I haven't really called things anxiety until about the last decade or so.
Mm,
I do think some of what I've experienced were things I hadn't experienced before as well.
yeah. Well, let's take a quick break here. Okay, we're back, and we're back with Jon Ward and his narrative, his memoir, Testimony Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. In the story, there's a character that floats in and out of this story that, uh, if I were to put it, you probably don't want to say it this, but it almost, if I were to put it in classic narrative structure, it's the dark villain of the story. I know you won't own that, but as a narrative reader, it almost feels like this is the Darth Vader figure, and literally like Darth Vader, because this is a father figure, a dark father figure for you. And I'm referring to C.J. Mahaney, who is a very well-known, influential pastor of a church called Sovereign Grace in Louisville. And this figure floats in very early on your story and then kind of recurs. So explain why your story required you to deconstruct who this particular person was, in your life and in the culture.
Sure. Trying to think about whether to start with the origins or kind of start with who he ended up becoming. You have a preference?
Start with who he become and then work backwards, because I think I don't
Yeah,
think that name is actually that familiar to
sure.
a lot of our listeners, and I think it's helpful for them to recognize this is a significant figure in the evangelical world, especially
Well,
yeah.
I mean, in my life and in the lives of those in our church, CJ represented that um, really larger than life leader, charismatic and talented and funny, and a little scary, even to those who were his followers and supporters and his fans. Um, and he did a good job of cultivating that following. There was a cult of personality around him, which is very common in many non denominational churches, evangelical churches. I mean, cults of personality are certainly not limited either to Christianity or to evangelicalism. And he was revered in our church. He was one of the original leaders who started our church, which grew to over 80 churches in multiple countries. He was the primary speaker, preacher on most Sundays. He handled the bulk of the preaching duties and was probably by far the most talented of the bunch in terms of those who would preach. And so that meant he had a regular role in our lives for those of us who went every week in speaking directly to us, shaping our imaginations and our view of the world. And the church really did revolve around him in a lot of ways. He and my dad went to high school together, so our families had a connection. Um, when I was 10, my dad was pushed out of his job as a minister, in part by CJ and his wife, and I've kind of stopped there in terms of details because that I think is starting to infringe on something that is pretty much my parents' story to tell and theirs alone. And that area of my story versus their story is obviously a complicated one, but that's one story that I will leave them to tell if they ever choose to do so. And if they don't, I fully understand. But when you get beyond our church, CJ began to become more nationally prominent in the early 2000s. He started to associate and work together with Mark Dever at Capitol Hill Baptist, Al Mohler down at Southern Seminary, Ligon Duncan out of, I believe, Jackson,
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi, First Presbyterian.
Yeah.
And John Piper was involved, though not part of it. It was Together for the Gospel, and CJ became sort of a nationally known speaker at that point.
And so, why then does he exercise a particular role in you? There's the family connection, but
Yeah.
what was his personal sort of influence on you, and why have you had to sort of deconstruct that a little?
Yeah. I mean, when you're, man, it's kind of hard to talk about, not because it's like uncomfortable or painful, but because it's uh it's complicated, and it's maybe something I haven't even worked through enough. But um that revered leader kind of holds the keys to so many things, so many doors. There are material things in terms of, if you want to advance up through the leadership ranks in the church, you have to have that person's approval or people around him.
Yeah.
Uh, and there's a divine sort of element to it as well. I mean, when somebody in a church culture claims to speak for the creator, that imbues the things that they say with incredible gravity and power.
Yeah.
And
And in terms in your book, you describe it's almost, in terms that they would have critiqued Catholicism for, but they almost a certain sense of infallibility that you could not object, you could not counter that was a sign of sin, of dissension, sign of dissension if you actually objected and disagreed with that voice, correct?
yes, and it is such a serious thing to say or even imply that you are speaking for God. And I think one of the things that upset me the most over the years of my time that in that world was the flippancy with which I saw people claim this mantle.
Yeah.
And and I think it's a lack of seriousness about something that can do great damage. So uh, there was a point close to 10 years, 7, 8 years after I had kind of removed myself from that church culture, where I saw even then that um, myself and many others had thought of CJ in quasi mystical slash divine terms. Like, we
Yeah.
just had this thought that he was on another plane from the rest
Yeah.
of us, almost infallible, to use your word, because when you do have somebody who says they're speaking for God, and then they do take measures to sort of remove themselves from day-to-day contact, as CJ did, with the commoners in the church, um, you know there begins to be this mystique about this person, as
Yeah.
if, if this is the only world, this person is on another level. So there were some things that came out about the way he had handled a dispute in the past that helped me to finally see, not that he was fallible, because I think I knew that by then, but just the degree to which he was fallible, I think. Uh, and the strength of my surprise showed me how much of a spell there had still
Yeah.
been in my imagination about him.
And for listeners, if you're interested, you can read the book, or you can just Google the story, the sort of recent events that have C.J. Mahaney's been involved in. It follows a very familiar pattern of this leadership style that exerts sort of authoritarian power. Is follows a very familiar pattern of when things go wrong in the organization, the cover up and the use of power to silence critics. You'll see that same pattern that we've talked a lot about in this podcast happening, in his realm as well. So I want to actually talk though about this complicated. Well, one of the things that CJ is complicated, like you said, is it's intertwined so deeply with your family. And one of the sort of anguishing parts of this book, your book, in the last few chapters, was you describing how much you were engaged in deconstruction, but many, if not most, of your own family of origin hasn't been, and how that has produced tension uh, between you and your family. Why do you think you've been involved in this process of deconstruction and reconstruction, but it seems like your family of origin hasn't?
Well, I mean, there are certain, like, groups. I come from a large family. I'm one of 7 children,
Yeah.
and so even within the 7 of us, there are different camps. There are those of us who have done more, I think, to you know, not just question, but move away from some of the ways we were raised. Um, there are others who have, in some ways, doubled down, and then there's a third group that is probably, uh, yeah, just maybe a little bit more ambivalent about it all.
Yeah.
Uh, so, so I don't know that there's anything all that unique about. I think a lot of it is individualistic.
Yeah.
Uh, there are personality types that go into it. I definitely think journalism has played a large role for me
Yeah.
uh, in helping me to think critically, and standing outside of partisan politics rather than sort of having my identity shaped by
Yeah.
uh, one political party or another. And I think what I saw in 2016 when I critiqued Trump was uh, a non-ideological, non-partisan critique on my part being perceived as partisan and ideological by siblings and parents who I think were not and maybe are still not aware of how much their identity is shaped by a political party and a political movement rather than, uh, you know, something else, such
Yeah.
as Christianity applied to politics.
Well, you mentioned just now that you think your role as a journalist, your formation as a journalist, had something to do with it. That's my hypothesis
Yeah.
for why this happened to you and not to your family. And this gets to a theme of my own work, which is that I really believe the Scripture tells the story of God revealing Himself not just via individuals, but also via institutions, including secular institutions, that it's not just the church that God images himself in the world. And I'm struck in your story as you depict this, where the church, the evangelical church you grew up in many ways had distorted the true image of God, and that you were in fact led to what I would believe and argue was a more accurate, truer image of God, not through the church, but really via this secular institution of journalism. That it was the, if you want to call it that, the discipleship process, the formational process you went through as a secular journalist, and the institution of journalism and what it taught you and
Mhm.
trained you to think, that actually in many ways you could say saved you. It saved you from
Yeah.
sort of the excesses and the abuses of and distortions of the evangelical church. Say, explain more how that happened. Like what was that like? Why did journalism have this impact on you?
One of the things that happens when you have an attitude that we know better
Mm.
is that you set up parallel institutions from those who don't know better. And that is, in a lot of ways, the story of a lot of evangelical culture for a long time. And it's that attitude, we know better, that caused the mishandling of sex abuse cases. Um, that attitude of we know better is probably also a large part of why the Creation Music Festival exists,
Right.
because we know better. So we're going to set up a music festival that, expresses art, but in a way that has the truths that we have that non-Christians don't have. Or even, other sects of Christianity or something. So, I think what happens when you have these parallel institutions and this parallel culture is that it actually degenerates by virtue of not interacting with others who think
Yeah.
differently. And so it actually becomes a subpar in terms culture in terms of quality. That's why for a long time that Christian music industry was mocked so roundly. I do feel like, a lot of religious music has caught up in a lot of ways,
Mhm.
um, probably better quality. Um, but I have observed, at different times, even in Jamar Tisby's um, critique of Taylor University, a recent firing of a professor there, there was just a lack of adhering to the to the university's own standards. It sounds like, in how they dismiss this teacher. And I think at times Christian culture can get by on saying we're all Christians here. let's just love one another and do right by one another. And unfortunately, a lot of times more secular settings and institutions can have a higher standard of excellence because of that. They don't give each other that excuse.
Yeah.
uh, and so I think that's part of the answer to the question.
Well, given that you experienced this truth seeking and higher standards through journalism and through the institutions of journalism, I wanted to ask you to help Christians better make sense of journalism and secular journalism, because I think there's this pervasive now narrative of distrust, of suspicion, fake news. You can't trust anything you read. What do you wish your fellow Christians grasped about the institutions of journalism, of secular journalism? What do you wish they knew and really internalized is happening and going on in these institutions?
Well, there's a process by which information goes to the printed page or even the TV screen, that people generally are probably not super aware of.
Yeah.
And that just involves going out and finding the information in the first place, which takes work, and then going through a process of editing, which in the better institutions is more than one round of editing, and usually more than one round of editors. So a team of editors, and so there is a sense of rigor to it. That doesn't mean it's infallible, of course. And I would also say the internet has degraded to some degree this culture of rigor and fact checking. But the DNA of major media institutions is a culture of having a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that stuff doesn't go out into the world that's half baked or inaccurate. And to the degree that media has failed to do that over the last decade or two or three, like, we own that, and we own the decline in trust. um, but there's also been a lot of politically motivated and commercially motivated criticism of the media that sometimes, I think, takes uh, the individual failures and
Yeah.
paints it as the norm. When
Yeah.
I think I still agree with Jonathan Rauch that by and large, this is the best system we have for producing
Absolutely.
reliable knowledge. And
Yeah.
you can definitely make that critique of media, and I will, agree with lots of the critiques. But when you're looking at the system day in and day out, there's a culture, there are methods, there are practices, there are standards, and that's something that, unless you've been in a newsroom or worked on one of these stories and actually, you know, done the work and understood. I mean, when you started this podcast, you were talking about how I've been spent time making sense of the world for other people, and I just thought to myself, yeah, it makes my head hurt to make, because it's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. And this is, again, why I want to emphasize that as Christians, we have to realize that God reveals truth, reveals even things about himself. And again, my term for this is imaging through institutions, and in particular, the institution of journalism. There's just absolutely zero chance you can make sense of this world by yourself as an individual. It's impossible. The world is too complex. The knowledge is too diverse. You need institutions set up with people like Jon Ward, who are paid to have their head hurt in terms of trying to make sense of the world for other people. And that's kind of how God designed it. Now, doesn't mean those institutions are, like you said, perfect or infallible. They also are cracked jars. They also are going to be made of fallible human beings. So just like the church is a cracked vehicle of God's revelation, journalism is a cracked vehicle and so we have to, approach it with some deconstruction as well. But it doesn't mean, just like you don't chuck out the gospel and the church because of the cracked vessel of the church, you also don't chuck out journalism just because there's the cracked vessels of specific institutions or practices or individuals. That this is the same process of deconstruction and reconstruction has to happen in our engagement of the institutions of journalism. We can't throw it out. It's impossible to make sense of the world without the help of these institutions. So that's my little plug for your for your profession, Jon.
There's also, this applies to journalism, but I think it also applies to the broader uh, comparison of church culture versus outside culture.
Yeah,
And that is, there's usually, oftentimes, a much greater degree of accountability and
that's really
consequence
true.
for
Yes, that's right.
failure
Yeah.
than in the outside world than there is in the church.
Yep.
And that gets to that attitude of, hey, we're all Christians. And I think you see this manifest in the way that there is a real, uh, in my observation, hypersensitivity to criticism inside the church,
Yeah.
which to me demonstrates a lack of familiarity with criticism.
Yeah.
If you are in the rough and tumble of regular mainstream media, public life in general, the business world, you're gonna be pretty familiar with getting your head knocked around a little bit, and
Yeah.
and you got to learn to try to do a job that's good enough,
Yep.
that eliminates as many opportunities for that as possible, and then you've got to also learn to respond either with an admission of error or with a counter argument when you are critiqued. And that's how you get better. That's how part of having a rigorous approach is knowing that if you mess up, there's going to be consequences.
Yep. Jon, we're heading to the home stretch here. I want to ask you to synthesize your experience of deconstruction by offering some advice to our listeners, because a lot of our listeners are going through their own version of this deconstruction and hopefully reconstruction process. They're not all going to have the luxury of writing a book to help them make sense of that
Yeah.
experience. So, what advice would you give people who, in their own way, are going through this process of sorting through what's been handed to them and saying, which of this do I want to keep? Which of this needs to be repaired? And what of this might need to get thrown out?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do hope that a lot of people who read the book, if either continue or intensify or begin their own process of thinking about their own life in this way, of looking back, examining, connecting dots, comparing, different points of view, um, examining that foundation, both of their life and of the culture that shaped them. So I would say I hope people write their thoughts down. Doesn't have to be to share with anybody. It could be for sharing with a spouse or a close friend or a larger group of people. It does not have to be for public consumption. But I think the act of writing is, obviously for some of us, I think it's obvious for some of us and maybe less obvious for others. I don't know. But to me, it's quite obvious that the act of writing is just sort of invaluable in helping us, first of all, process and then organize our thoughts, and then sort of build from there and keep moving forward. And then I would also say, talk to people in a reportorial mode,
Mm.
or a inquisitive student type of
Mm.
mindset, where you're going to ask people questions, not to try to win an argument or to persuade somebody, but to really try to understand either something that happened in your life or a perspective on an issue where you might be wondering, this person thinks differently. What are they maybe seeing that I don't see? I don't necessarily agree, but I also feel like there's something there, like
Hmm.
anything like that, or a part of your life that you want to understand better. Just take that, that learner's mind,
Yeah.
and go out and start asking
I
questions.
like it. I like the way you called it first, the repertorial mind. It is like one of the gifts that journalism has to the world, including to Christians, is cultivating that inquisitive learner's mind that suspends judgment and assumes there's something you don't know that you need to find out. I love that. That's great advice. And applying that to our own lives and our own pasts seems like a very rich way to do deconstruction right, I think, healthily.
It's a lot of, I mean, there are parts of our all of our lives that are painful, but in general, I think this process is incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
It's an adventure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, John, I end every podcast with a guest by asking them the same three questions that are about things that we are all hungry for as human beings: good news, hope, and joy. So we're going to start with good news. What piece of good news do you have to share with listeners?
I would want to point people to the Forward Party, which is a third party political organization, which is fairly new. I think it's formed over the last year. The most prominent person people will have heard of is Andrew Yang, who
Mm-hmm.
ran for president and then New York City mayor. Both times, lost, but made, a bit of a splash. But I think what's encouraging to me and what is good news about the Forward Party is that they are really focused on starting at the local level.
Mm.
And so I think they are one of probably many groups that is understanding the need for local community organizing,
Yeah.
politically and socially, to try to help us all connect with one another better, to solve our problems together more effectively. And I would just say Joel Searby, who I think is the executive director,
Mm-hmm.
if that's his title, of the Forward Party, is somebody I know personally, is a friend, and is just a guy of huge integrity and just a wonderful, wonderful human being and a very devout Christian. So I think there's a lot there to be encouraged by.
All right. We'll put the link to the Forward Party in the show notes if you want to check that out further. Okay. Second item, hope. What personal practice of yours, John, sustains your own sense of hope?
Yeah, this might be a little unorthodox, maybe not, but planning meals on a week to week or even monthly basis and then cooking them. I try to cook a meal. I try to cook our dinner 3 to 4 times a week so
Mm-hmm.
that we can um, have leftovers, but also so that we have 5 kids, and so that we can sit down together and have a meal together. There are a lot of things that give me hope in that. Obviously, sitting with my children and talking and eating together gives me hope, but just the process of tangibly, creating something
Yeah.
for my family to facilitate that time is just something that is uniquely hope giving. Yeah,
I love that. My wife is the upholder of that practice for our family. Just always going to make a home cooked meal.
yeah,
We're going to sit down, and you're completely right that it is a hope refilling process. We
yeah,
talked about this with Ann Snyder Brooks a couple of episodes back about just how important that shared embodied presence with one another is, how we are wired to experience hope in the world. So I love that.
yeah.
All right, last one, joy. What's one movie, book, or some other content that has given you joy recently?
I'm going to answer with two things, and you're probably going to have to stop me
Okay.
here before I get on too much of a roll. Book wise, I would say the author that has given me the most joy over the last year has been Frederick Buechner.
Oh,
Uh,
yes.
he has a trilogy of memoirs, and it was his latter two that I just felt like I was sitting in front of a fire with a whiskey or a hot cup of coffee, with a warm blanket around me, talking to a close friend. It was just such a beautiful thing.
Yes.
And then live music is always something that gives me a lot of joy. We went and saw Andy Schauf recently with two of our older daughters, and that was a beautiful moment. I just saw Jim Axelrod interview Bruce Springsteen about the
Mm.
recording of his Nebraska album, which I highly recommend. And last summer, we went to the Solid Sound Festival in Northwest Massachusetts, which is run by Wilco, which was a 3-day outdoor music festival and just a life highlight. So live music just gives me a lot of joy.
Buechner and live music. Love it. My put in my vote for my own personal Buechner favorite, Telling the Truth. I absolutely love that book. So, which is The Gospel is Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. But almost anything by Buechner you pick up, you're going to get some joy out of that experience. So,
Yeah.
Jon, it has also been a joy to have you on this podcast and to dive deeper into your story. Thank you for writing the book. It's called Testimony Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation by Jon Ward. Available anywhere on Amazon and all your typical books buying places, and also Jon's podcast, The Long Game. Recommend both of them. Jon, thanks so much for being part of the Good Faith.
Curtis, I really appreciate your mind and your heart, and thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right, listeners, we will once again be back next week when we once again gather around the campfire.